Tax Justice, as well as the Gender Working Group. And we're so excited to have so many different stakeholders to engage in this conversation with. Today, we will be discussing how progressive taxation can support countries to combat climate change and foster feminist and green measures for economic recovery in response to the current multidimensional crisis that we find ourselves in. And so we are going to kick ourselves off with a keynote speech, and then after that, open up to a round panel conversation, and then follow that up with a Q&A. Just to note that we have interpretation available. So if you would like to listen to this particular conversation, either in French or Spanish, please go ahead and click on the interpretation globe that should reflect right at the bottom of your screen, and select the language that you are most comfortable listening to this conversation in. So without any further ado, I'm now going to welcome Ms. Carola Othim from the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, who's going to give us a few opening remarks and really set the context for this conversation. So Caroline, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chennai, and thank you all for joining this event. Really, it's a reflection point for us to reflect on the 3 years since we have been able to have face-to-face meetings at the CSW in New York. Of course, this has been occasioned by the global COVID-19 pandemic. It has, of course, been quite a challenging time, but also a reflective time for all of us. And as a collective, the tax justice movement, working closely with the women's rights movement, we are continuing to reflect on the multiple intersecting discriminations that women and other marginalized groups are continuing to experience. And more so because the COVID-19 pandemic presented a golden opportunity for us who are working in economic justice, in gender justice, to really think through feminist perspectives for a progressive taxation to ensure an equal green and feminist transition. And so more than ever at the moment, it is quite urgent for governments and multilateral institutions to be able to take action for tax justice in order to realize women's rights, because the realization of these rights have been greatly impacted by the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. And also, as you look around the world, both global level, regional level, national level tax policies to really impact negatively both women and girls. We see current tax laws and practices really enabling the wealthy elite and multinational corporations to get away with not paying their fair share of taxes, thereby denying governments the key sources of funding to support public services, and therefore to power and wealth, which is quite crucial to realizing women's rights and gender equality. And so the Global Alliance, together with our regional networks in Africa, Tax Justice Network Africa, in Asia, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, Latin America, I don't know how to say the name in English, but I can try in Spanish, Red Justicia Fiscal. And we have our colleagues in Europe, Tax Justice Network Europe. North America, we have the FACT Coalition in the United States of America, and Canadians for Tax Fairness in Canada, working closely with members of our Tax and Gender Working Group to be part of the annual campaign on Make Taxes Work for Women. This campaign is dubbed the Annual Global Days of Action for Tax Justice for Women's Rights. It kicked off on the 14th of March, and it will run up to the 25th of March, coinciding with the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. And so really, this is an important opportunity for us to continue dialoguing, to continue engaging with policymakers on tax issues that are affecting women, particularly on the agreed conclusions document. We would want really to ensure that our language is reflected in that document. The previous Global Days of Action editions have been very groundbreaking in mobilizing the tax justice movement on one hand and the women's rights movement on the other hand to really work together to highlight the urges of making this work for, because they're the ones who have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And so we are doing this by highlighting 5 key demands, which I would want to share with us at this point. I know we may have interacted with this previously, but I would want to reiterate them at this point. Number 1 is that we are calling on multinational, multilateral institutions and national governments to ensure that tax and fiscal policies are in line with the 5R framework of the Rebuilding Social Organization of Care to recognize, to reduce, to redistribute, to reclaim, and to reward care and domestic work. Number 2 is that there's need to reduce unfair tax burdens on women, progressive, redistributive, and gender equal taxation. Of course, including taxation of capital and wealth and less reliance on consumption taxes. Number 3 is to remove gender bias and discriminations in tax policies and to ensure that tax revenues are raised and spent in ways that promote gender equality. Number 4 is to ensure adequate financing of gender-responsive public services that promote women's rights and reduce inequalities, including by gender budgeting. And lastly, the call for an inclusive intergovernmental UN global tax body. And currently at the moment, there's a draft convention in place. Have a look at that, and hopefully Lahey will be able to drop in a link to this convention in the chat box. So I would really want to welcome you to join the conversation today, join the discussion, share with us your perspectives on how we can be able to work closely with the different institutions, with our different governments, to ensure that the transition is feminist, the transition is just, and to ensure that the transition is green enough. So thank you so much, Chennai, and thank you all very much. Thank you so much to Rosa Pavanelli for agreeing to be the keynote speaker during this event. We really appreciate the work that you are doing within the Global Union and your leadership in that area. And of course, together with my colleagues from other civil society organizations who are also forming part of this panel. So without taking much time, let me hand it back to you, Chennai, so that you can guide us on the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you so much for setting the context. I think absolutely, I think this particular meeting, like you've indicated, we've been having similar meetings over the years, but it's so important to reiterate the value that bringing together the women's movement and the tax justice movement can bring in helping us move through a just transition. So without any further ado, because Carol, you preempted me a little bit, I'm really excited to introduce our keynote speaker for our session today, Ms. Rosa Pavanelli, who is the General Secretary of the Global Union Federation Public Services International. We are so excited to have you with us. Thank you so much for making the time, and I'm so happy to hand over back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chennai. Good day to everyone. And I must thank you for inviting PSI and inviting me to introduce this very important discussion. I don't know if I will be able to address all the issues that we need to consider in order to work for a gender-based transition that would eliminate the different form of injustice and inequality that continue to affect women's lives around the world. But I'm very passionate on this theme because I consider that gender inequality is the most unacceptable discrimination on earth. Because when you discriminate 50% of the global population, this is something that is much more than a bias. much more than a stereotype. It's something that is simply unacceptable. And also, I'm very passionate on the issue of tax and tax justice, because I consider that the tax injustice, the rotten system that we have in the global taxation, is the root cause of the growing inequality we have been witnessing in the past years, in the past decades. And it's also responsible for shifting the power from governments, democratic institutions, towards private interest, towards the vested interest of business and capital. And no need to say that those who are leading the game at global level are normally men, white men for the most part, and that are perpetuating a patriarchal system where there's little room for accessing, for women to access leading position, but there's also very little room to consider a change in this paradigm. We saw that since the 80s, taking powers, multinational corporates are taking power and becoming the real rulers in our communities, in our societies, and at a global level. And more we see that I cannot say leaders, political leaders are on the payroll of multinational corporates, but we see more and more that elected leaders, politicians in our so-called democratic institutions are often supported by electoral campaign donations that comes from multinational corporates. And this is affecting for sure the global north, but is something that affects also the global south and the developing world, with the difference that when it happens in the north, it's normally called lobbying. When it happens in the south, it's called corruption. But the matter is that when lobby is meant to elect people that have to respond to the interest of business, it's the highest form of corruption. Because it's not only corrupting the person, the political party, but it's corrupting the institution, the democratic system that we, on the contrary, we aim to preserve and to maintain. And we saw that this mechanism has created the legal base, the foundation for more and for reducing more and more the impact of progressive taxation systems, putting the burden of tax revenues on the shoulders of workers and creating loopholes, tax holidays, and all that we know about tax havens for big corporates and business and the financial system. I think that this is and we have been working during the past 15, 20 years, but more effectively, I would say, in the past 10 years, trying to address this issue. And finally, I must say that it is globally recognized that the system cannot continue in this way. After the 2008 financial crisis, the opportunity to correct the system was lost. On the contrary, we saw growing the influence of corporates on the political system, on the global governance. And now we see that this is getting even more important. But at the end, I must say that some step we have done, because it's now globally recognized that a system like this cannot work. The decision to adopt a minimum tax for corporate at global level is an admission by the global institutions that this is a failure of the system. Although the decision that has been taken is absolutely insufficient, absolutely not adequate to address the problem. First of all, because 15% is almost closer to the minimum tax that even in some of the tax havens is imposed to corporates. Second, because it will benefit the global north and won't benefit at all governments in the global south. And it's not creating the condition to re-establish the progressiveness in the taxation system that we actually need. We said that this is something that cannot be addressed by individual government, even though individual government have the opportunity, the possibility, and even the authority to establish more progressive taxations, more just taxation, and reduce the inequality that is current ongoing everywhere. But I think that despite all the promises, what we are witnessing right now, the situation we are in right now, is even worse than the one that created the 2008 financial crisis, because it's not just the corporate claiming, asking for tax benefits when they invest in a country. Is now the real risk is that corporates are those defining the rules. And this is happening through the mechanism that I already mentioned, supporting political candidates at a national level, but it's happening also through this supposed to be democratic principle of multi-stakeholder participation at a global level within the UN system. Multi-stakeholder means that everyone can participate on an equal basis. That's what they pretend they ask us to believe, but actually this is just a euphemism to let big business corporate to sit at the table, be part of the decision-making process, because you tell me, and you can teach me, that if you don't bring money, you have little voice within the UN agencies, within the UN system. And this is creating the conditions for an even worse corrupted system, putting at stake the principle itself of our democratic organization, democratic institutions. and shifting even more the power from governments to private interest, to private corporates. I think this is very, very dangerous for our future. And addressing the issue of tax justice is key to reestablish a balance in powers. It's key. Because without this initiative, we won't be able to address not only the multiple crises we are facing, from the health crisis to the climate crisis, to the gender inequalities and injustice, but also the possibility to raise our voice, have a say in this process. And I think this is getting more and more important for women because of the discrimination that women are suffering around the world continue to be even more aggressive and more severe. We have seen what it meant during the COVID pandemic, not being able to provide the adequate services that with sufficient income in the public budget could have been ensured. The damages that they created, not only in terms of inability to treat patients adequately, protecting workers in an adequate way, as unfortunately happened during the pandemic, but also to create the conditions to provide the care services that are essential to ensure women have the possibility to access the labor market. And I'm not only thinking that we need care services because women, this is a sector that is predominantly female dominated. But I think that we need those services to let women access the labor market in all sectors where they want to express their skills, their career, their labor activity. And I'm afraid that this situation will become even more hard to address given the current energy crisis due to the increase of the cost of oil, of fuel, and also due to the crisis that is created by the war in Ukraine, which will push even further the cost of energy. And this will impact on women in a very severe way. Besides all other considerations that we can do on that, I personally believe that we as feminist movement should launch a strong call for reducing investment in armament, for a serious disarmament process that is not only needed to respond to the current conflicts and crises, but also to make available resources that can be used to address the social need that we have to repair the injustice that billions of people continue to suffer around the world, and particularly women. But I also believe that we need to consider that this situation will impact again on increasing the tax injustice we are suffering and impacting again the possibility to invest in socially productive sectors rather than in sectors that can create conflict, war, and violence. So these are, let me say, a sort of three thoughts that I think are important to consider for our campaign and our fight ahead. Is that pessimistic, the scenario? Well, we have many challenges, let me say so. What we have from our side is the fact that we have been able to create the awareness in women and in people around the world, particularly during these past 2 years of pandemic. And now people is aware what it means to have the possibility to ensure social protection to everyone, ensure care services to everyone, and the importance of having women fully participating in the decision-making process of our communities. I think this is our resource. And I think also that we need to count on the positive aspect of globalization, which is our interconnectivity, the capacity that we have to keep ties and to promote initiatives even from remote so being apart, being far away one another, but connecting on a global scale. And yes, although in crisis, although put at stake by the predominant presence of corporates and business, I do believe that there cannot be a response, a positive response to the tax justice claim, if not under the umbrella of the UN system, where all governments can have a voice, all nations can say what they need, and all interests can be addressed. Under this point of view, I think that we need to be aware and we need to be prepared to fight the decision that is going to be formalized in the OECD, that will be the leading institutions on global tax reform for the future. That means, again, leaving in the hand of the rich countries the power to decide whether they want or not to tax corporate, who they want to benefit, and who they want to invite at the table among the other developing countries, because of course this is not a global participation. It is you are kindly invited to participate to the OECD discussion and table, and this is creating further dependence, further perpetuation of the colonial system that has been that is the root of this unequal development and injustice that continue to endure at global level. I don't know if I have addressed all the issues that you were expecting me to address, but I thought it was important in this moment to try to highlight the challenges, the threats, and also, how to better use the opportunity that we have in this moment. From our point of view, we as Public Services International have been doing and continue to do a lot of work in increasing awareness in among our members. We have creating training models for workers and women workers that we develop at regional level and at a national level, so we are able to adapt to the different taxation system. And this has been very positive for us because it helped us to talk about tax with a different knowledge, bringing knowledge to our members, because sometimes government thinks that workers cannot understand what tax reforms means because it's too technical, it's too complicated. That's not true. You need to tell them what it means. You need to teach. You need to provide all the information and the knowledge that is needed for them to being able to negotiate. And this is a key from our perspective and point of view. And of course, the role of women is crucial in this sense. And particularly, in many of the developing countries where women are the most reliable in terms of managing the resources of a family, managing the resources of an organization and things like that. So I think that we have done important step forwards. We have still a lot of way ahead. And I'm happy that we continue to walk this way together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Thank you so much for those remarks and for all of the points that you made that really sort of set the tone for this conversation. Thank you for, first of all, unpacking the different crises that we're facing right now, which make the need for this conversation even more pertinent. Thank you for speaking to the current conversations that are happening at a global level that speak to this flawed and broken system. But unfortunately, the way in which those conversations are happening essentially are putting out results that don't fully reflect the interests, particularly of global South countries. It's interesting, we had a conversation similar to this 2 weeks ago with Professor Jayati Ghosh, and she mentioned the exact same points that you made. And she used this tagline where she said tax justice is gender justice and gender justice is tax justice. And so absolutely there is a need for us to continue to push for progressive taxation systems so that we can see the advancement of women, of gender rights, of women's equality. So without any further ado, I'm really excited about the panel that we have now that's essentially going to start further unpacking the conversation that Rosa just set for us. We have 5 different panelists, all amazing women doing amazing work in different regions. And so essentially we'll be speaking to the way in which their work points to the conversation we're having now. So the first panelist we have today is Alina Saba. Alina is from the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And so she'll really sort of be speaking to what the human rights perspectives of framing tax systems looks like. So Alina, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and as you do that, I think my first question to you is, why do we need a profession? Keen to hear your thoughts as well. Alina, over to you.
Thank you, Sanai, for the question, and I would like to thank Sanai, Caroline, Rosa, and everyone on the panel. I'm very happy to here today with you, everyone, for this important event. So to start with, I would like to talk about a little bit context on the topic of this event and where we are today. Like the CSW comes with the message on empowerment of women and girls in times of climate crisis comes in a time of double crisis of both pandemic and climate crisis. So we know like that it is a fact now that disproportionate impact of climate change on women and girls, on indigenous communities, and those on the global south countries who are most vulnerable to climate change is not further a topic of agreement, disagreement, or discussion, but it is established fact. And now it's time for us to move towards the climate action. How do we need to take this action, and what we need for this action is resources. We need money. So the discussion has to shift towards, in my opinion, towards more like looking for resources for taking action, because as of today, we have a lot of normative agreements and policy agreements like Paris Climate Agreements and many more on impacts of climate change, but there is very less consensus on what a just distribution looks like of that resources or the agreements that had been shed there. And just to give some examples to talk about climate finance that we need for the just transition and feminist transition. So far, out of all the climate finance money has been channeled, 80% is of almost $60 billion is in the form of loan to the poor countries. So this is such a failure of that mechanism and structure of the climate finance, which was supposed to be given by the developed countries to the developing countries on the principle of human rights, on principle of common but differentiated responsibility. And this is just one example. And to further, if we look at that structure, the access to that structure is mostly by multinational corporations, big infrastructural, like for big infrastructural projects, for mitigations, energy project, but not to poor women who are working on informal sector jobs or in rural economy or like informal, some small scale farming and fisheries. So this is another challenge for feminist movements and for civil societies, like why the climate finance? At first place, there is not enough money and resources. And on the second place, the structure of those institutions are so rigid that the most impacted community, the women and girls, are not able to access it. And this has been further impacted by the pandemic. And because we saw there were so many millionaires becoming billionaires during pandemic, whereas the developing, some low-income countries were further pushed deeper into the poverty and debt. So it shows that we live in a world of misplaced priorities, because at one hand, we have climate crisis and debt to solve, whereas on the other hand, if we look at the data, as Rosa mentioned before, the corporates are becoming more powerful and powerful every day. They are receiving trillions of money in subsidies. Just to give some example of some data, in 2020, some research shows that they received 5.9 trillion for fossil fuel industries just in 2020, whereas the world and some developing countries were like struggling to gather money to fund the vaccine campaigns in their country. And similarly, there was a research on how much money we lose on tax evasion every year. It's almost like 427 billion. Those money we could have used in funding feminist and just transition, funding climate finance or adaptation projects that works for those on the front line of community. And in one of the example, how does it impact the social protection systems of country? I would like to give example of one work in Colombia, one of the most unequal countries in Latin America region. CSR had done and research in the past, and it shows that they were giving away 10% of the GDP to fund the fossil fuel extractive industries as tax incentives. So this interchange of tax abuse, tax incentives, and subsidies is the real culprit of progressive taxation, real challenge for progressive taxation. As long as they keep on playing, it will be really difficult for channeling money to public services, climate finance, or even addressing impacts of climate change in a true sense. So So this is one of the biggest challenges for us, but there are solutions as well. Like we need to work in solidarity, cross-movement building and together, and progressive taxation is one of the solutions for this global challenge. And we need to work it, globally, in a global solidarity together. So for that, I would like to go back and remind to talk about how we can work globally, because at this current global economy, some of the low-income countries' economy has such a constrained fiscal policy because of the design of this unequal economic system. They have loans to pay, they have debt, and the increasing climate crisis demands a lot of money for mitigation and adaptation process. So they are stuck in between, and they are just helpless, but they keep cutting off money from social protections, because some of the loans comes even with unconcessional agreements that comes with austerity policies. So there is two things to highlight here. At first, developed countries has put developing countries for double crisis of both climate change and debt crisis. So they need to take the responsibility for both historical emissions of carbon, for climate change, and this unequal economic system of debt crisis, and which has been worsened by the pandemic. So to address this challenge, I would like to go back to some 25 years back, when all the pioneer feminists gathered together in Beijing and adopted this Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action. And then they had recognized that environment and women's rights is a key area to work together. And they had also recognized mobilization of finance and international cooperation as one of the key areas to work in solidarity. But so far, there has not been much improvement or serious commitments on that. As Rosa mentioned before, it is one of the most unacceptable thing, the gender inequality, but our priorities seems very misplaced. So to build on those historical achievements of our sisters and feminist work, we need to work more together and build awareness and create more knowledge and resources on this tax justice issue, tax evasion issues, on climate finance issues, and at the same time also frame it on a human rights perspective, because we have seen the failure of not framing this issue from a human rights perspectives, because the international states, governments, and other multilateral institutions, they fail to deliver a just tax regime or system. So I think it has come a time to look it from human rights perspective and give a clear message out to the public that we need money to realize human rights. Without resources and finance, we cannot realize our human rights. And saving people, public, from impacts of climate change is a human rights issue. And if they fail to do so, states are also failing to oblige to their obligation, failing their obligation to protect, respect human rights. So this is one way to frame it. And another important issue is states are also obliged for mobilization of finances at the maximum available resources and international cooperation, extraterritorial obligations in the spirit of cooperation. That could be technical or financial cooperation. This has also been agreed in Paris Climate Agreement. It has also been said in Beijing Declaration, Platform of Action. So in line with these obligations, states should act and work towards raising revenues, and progressive taxation is one of the key way to mobilize the resources, but it cannot be done in silos. It needs a global effort. We need to all work together on it, and to achieve that.
Absolutely. I think, Alina, I'm just going to cut you short because I know there's so much to say, but we've got quite a few people to go through. But the nice thing about it is that Emilia, who is speaking next, is actually going to be speaking about this sort of tax and environmental agenda. So we'll be able to come back to you to speak on that. So Emilia, really great to have you. Very quick introduction. So Emilia Reyes is joining us from the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. And like I said, she's going to be talking to us about tax and the environmental agenda, a great segue from Alina's comments. So Emilia, over to you.
Thank you so much, and very honored to be with all of you and follow Rosa Pavanelli's and Alina Saba's intervention. It's a pleasure. Just wanted to add some elements of my own experience. I'm also with Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia, which is a Mexican feminist organization working in the intersection of many of these issues. So just wanted to say that in my experience also there is a dissonance on what the feminist movement is saying, the environmental movement is saying, the economic justice movement is saying, all of them bringing so much knowledge and what the labor movement has been doing in terms of just transition. But it seems like there are disconnects on what people understand of the proposals. So I think we really need to get together and work together more closely and listen to each other at the different frameworks that we have. Because, for instance, the environmental movement has been so far calling for the 100 billions in commitment on climate finance, as was mentioned already by Alina. But Alina also framed the dimension of the trillions dollars that have been pushed towards the fossil fuels industry. So there is this disconnect between the call for international cooperations in terms of ODA, or even fulfilling the financial commitments in terms of what has been agreed on the international framings, but the reality of the real system that is happening there. So I just wanted to say that we do not only need finance, we do not only need money, we need a shift in the way our systems are working. ODA is not enough, climate finance is not enough if we do not shift the entire system on how things are working. And this is why I totally support the call for a restructuring of the international financial and economic architecture as a whole, because there is no other way in which we are going to address the environmental emergency, not only climate change, but also the environmental and ecosystem destruction and the loss of biodiversity, etc. So we really need a shift in all of the major agendas, as were already being pointed out, like the debt crisis or the tax crisis. But also I wanted to highlight that from my experience, I mean, we've been working on gender responsive budgeting for many years, and it is our experience as well that mostly the feminist efforts have been focalized in social expenditure, which is totally crucial. But then we haven't been able to go above the 1% of the federal budgets, because those have, allocated direct beneficiaries, whereas the rest of the sectors, which are infrastructure, agriculture, energy, transportation, etc., has been left untouched because there is no direct beneficiaries there. And I think that is a major mistake, because when we are talking about gender, it's not only about women, it's really about a gendered social order that is cross a code with these, especially the sexual division of labor. And as feminists from Equidad, we are extremely worried that there is a sole focus on adaptation, and in rural settings where the most the origin of the problem of the climate emergency, especially in climate change, is on mitigation. And that means, where are the larger emissions coming from? And a major source of problem is urban settings, because that is a major source, on the one hand, on emission, and on the other, of the demand of the consumption, for instance, from energy, from rural and surrounding spaces. And the feminist movement needs to start tackling mitigations agendas. How are we going to bring in, precisely in the notion of the gender a just transition, an equitable transition. How? Because, you know, with the sexual division of labor, it has been the male-dominated sectors that had been responsible for the carbon emissions, energy, infrastructure, transportation, you know, even the macro projects that are related to agriculture. And because of the sexual division of labor, women have been on the receiving end of the negative impacts. But when the finance for the just transition come, for instance, for transitioning in the sector of energy from fossil fuels or extraction to, let us say, solar, that means that we're shifting workers, male workers, from one sector to the other, and women will be left out of the equation, precisely because the logic of the state and the system of the sexual division of labor is just reproducing it without our analysis on the macro level on how women are, on the one hand, not only on the receiving end of the negative impacts, but also because of the sexual division of labor, they remain subsidizing the economy with the task of unpaid domestic and care work. So these are, of course, this is where we see the very crucial role of progressive taxation linked to an expenditure that is linked, that is definitely taken into consideration the needs and interests of women. But to a larger extent, I think we are missing the point on the larger dynamics of what is happening in mitigation and what are the activities that are happening there. I just pointing out that there are many human rights violations happening right now with the transition towards green projects, and we are not taking into account that the other elements of collective rights, labor rights, indigenous people's rights, local community rights under the framework of green. So I think we really need to start engaging in a deeper analysis on how are we going to bring about solutions. And just to close, Chennai, before you cut me off, I just want to say I'm extremely worried that CSW is not tackling any of these issues. And of course, the UNFCCC has been rejecting to address these issues. There is a conversation now in Geneva about the biodiversity targets that is falling really short. And really, so if it's not up to us as global movements and collectives to rise up, we are having a very strong, very narrow window of opportunity in the next 10 years. And we should be concerned, and we should all be taking action in these larger agendas. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emilia. I think thank you so much for that challenge. I guess because you're absolutely all right. First of all, thank you for framing it so beautifully, right? The two different conversations that need to be much more interlinked, but the work that we need to do as movements to ensure that these conversations that need to start happening in the mainstream. So I know there were quite a few questions that were coming up as you were speaking. So we'll tackle a lot of these a little bit later during the Q&A. I'm now going to hand over to Bhumika. Bhumika is with the Third World Network, as well as the Financing for Development Civil Society Coalition. So Bhumika, could you give us a little bit of your thoughts around how the turn to fiscal or austerity has impacted women and gender, particularly at a structural level? And I know you've been doing some work in Ecuador as well, so please give us a bit of insight from some of the work that you've been doing on the ground. So over to you, Bhumika.
Thank you so much, Chennai, and all my fellow colleagues and feminist civil society leaders. Really happy to be on this panel. So just, following my colleagues, Alina, Emilia, as well as Rosa, our keynote speaker, structural inequalities and gender need systemic solutions. They cannot be separated between climate and fiscal policy and trade and tax policy, as well as the larger, structural crisis of debt colonialism. So, here we have, since the onset of COVID-19, we have a turn towards fiscal austerity. It's even more severe than since the global financial crisis. It's almost on the level of the kind of sweeping structural adjustment programs of the 1980s. We have seen that there was a brief period of fiscal spending in 2020 and then a turn towards fiscal austerity. The fiscal austerity has been deeply gendered. It has been even more severe since the financial crisis. And today in 2022, it's affecting 85% of the world's population. And when we say austerity measures are gendered, we mean they generate structural and cyclical poverty, inequality, injustice, practices and exploitation of and for women and girls. The measures include everything from public expenditure contraction, regressive taxation such as value-added taxes, labor flexibilization, privatization of state-owned enterprises, decrease of minimum wages, and the impacts on human rights, poverty, inequality are occurring through this diminished access to public services, especially health, education, pensions, and social protection, loss of livelihoods, increased unpaid work, increased time poverty, and the budget cuts by the state often reduce and eliminate the very programs and services which primarily benefit low-income women on the intersections of vulnerability, marginalization, and age-old oppressions. So we see women being pushed into unemployment and precarious work, often in the informal economy, and long-term damages to income, health, and well-being. And here we bring out this concept of embodied debt, in that women across the global South, women across the world have long advocated that austerity and debt be reformulated and translated into a publicly accessible and gendered debate, which is shorn of its technocratic language and situated in the dimensions of the lived experiences of women. So when we say embodied debt, we are talking about the well-being impacted on all registers of mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being, in that when we talk about embodied debt, it is the appropriation or even theft of women's unpaid social reproductive labor, which not only subsidizes, but also generates the enabling conditions for the male-led wage economy. Embodiment then joins the human condition to the natural condition, making economics a lived experience. Gendered austerity demands that economics is made into a lived experience and not just physical, technical, macroeconomic, and debt policies. Embodiment joins theory to practice, making the politics of economic policy historically sensitive and accountable to the registers of patriarchy and neoliberalism. And third, embodiment unites the experience of knowledge experience and knowledge of women through the material conditions of their everyday life. So it grounds us in gender inequality and women's rights in day-to-day life. Now, I'll just give you a really quick snapshot of Ecuador. Ecuador has had this IMF loan called the Extended Fund Facility for the last 27 months. It goes back to about 2019. There's been so many social movements and outcries in the country, led by indigenous women, led by public sector workers, led by nurses. And in particular, this loan is a precondition for the debt restructuring of the country's 17.4 billion loan with international creditors. Ecuador is a dollarized economy, so that further makes it problematic because they operate in dollars. Now note that this kind of fiscal austerity conditions are a precondition for debt restructuring. So when we in civil society call for debt restructuring, we call for a multilateral mechanism for debt restructuring, for equitable burden sharing of the debt between creditors and debtors. The fact that developing countries are spending far more on debt repayments than they are on their COVID response, on their health and social spending. But austerity measures are precondition. So that's when we need to really rethink that when we talk about debt justice, we're talking about debt justice, debt restructuring being made available to developing countries without a precondition of austerity. Austerity today in this COVID era is a precondition for almost any kind of debt relief measure. It's a precondition to access all kinds of financing. Austerity cannot be a precondition. So when we're looking at austerity, especially in Ecuador, I'd like to point out two key channels. One in public health and one in time poverty. We look at public health. In Ecuador, 60% of workers in the health sector are women and 85% of nurses are women. And we talk about this triple jeopardy of austerity in public systems, where the majority of public sector workers are women, the majority of public service users are women, the majority of recipients of social protection systems are women. So we did interviews along with our colleagues in the Ecuadorian Center for Economic and Social Rights, we conducted several interviews with nurses, union leaders in one of the largest public hospitals in Ecuador. And here we learned that, even in the IMF loan, the public payroll or the public wage bill, which is a big section of all public expenditure across all countries in the world, the IMF actually sees the public wage bill as a challenge to debt sustainability. In fact, in the Ecuadorian loan, in the IMF's loan framework with Ecuador, it was stated that the public wage bill was seen as a progressive income tax because public sector employees earn above the median income. You see this twisted rationale where because public sector employees such as health workers and nurses earn above the median income, which is quite low, they actually rationalized cuts to the public wage bill. This is a kind of bizarre justification for cutting the wage bill. Now, Patricia Calderon, a nurse in Ecuador, she said that when COVID started, we asked the hospital authorities to provide us with the necessary equipment, but it was rationed. And most of us could not get any of the supplies. We had to buy masks with our own money. This created really deep stress for workers. Many of my colleagues also had to stay home in order to quarantine. Salary was not provided during the quarantine, and we had to protect our own health as well as that of our children. They requested that nurses outside of the intensive care unit be allowed to work remotely and care for their patients through digital communication during the height of COVID. This permission was not granted, and workers had to take quarantine by taking unpaid leave. The workers who are mothers had to pay for childcare out of their own income. Even the rooms within the hospital were not made available for quarantine. And during late and extended hours, food was not made available for health workers either. When asked why, the hospital management said there was no food available for hospital patients even, much less for the workers. The hospital had no surplus funds, even for emergency equipment, because every cent was being spent. Nurses then experienced a lot of physical illnesses and injuries, even chronic pain. Patricia said, I suffered from neuralgia all over my arm. Everyone at the hospital was suffering from some kind of ailments. Most of us nurses would break down crying repeatedly. This is really difficult to talk about because our coworkers would call us and ask us to do anything to help them, since we were part of the union, but even the union couldn't really help with these kinds of deep budget cuts. So these are just some testimonies that we've collected that really bring to life the lived experience of austerity. It is not just fiscal policy. It is really about this embodied debt, and in terms of the toll of this embodied debt, it is a real questioning of who owes the debt to whom. Is the national debt being paid to foreign creditors by the bodies and the emotional, physical, and spiritual toll that it takes on women's bodies? So we really see how women's lives on every register is paying the foreign debt of the nation. So who owes the debt to whom? And in terms of just to conclude, I just want to also point out the importance of care work. I think we all know the importance of care work, but we can think of care work as also leading to this time poverty. And time poverty, I think in some ways is wrongly named because it's not just a loss of leisure time. It is also about the material deprivation of the household, especially to the children, because of the loss of care and attention and consumption that could be enabled by the unpaid labor that there is no time for. So in this sense, women are embodying social provisioning as well, in terms of the kind of lack of time being made available to the care of children and to the care of family. So in conclusion, when we talk about fiscal policy reform, we have to talk about really re-understanding and recalibrating, who owes the debt to whom, and what are the assumptions being made on the work of women in the carrying out austerity, in terms of women being really substituting for the role of the state, compensating for the failure of the state.
Thanks so much, Bhumika. Thanks so much for, really just sort of putting into context, right, what debt is, right? And absolutely this notion of the embodiment of debt, I think is something that doesn't receive as much traction as it should. And then those sort of case stories that you spoke to. I mean, I know you were talking about Ecuador, but I mean, I'm currently working in Africa, but really, I think that that's a case study that cuts across so many developing countries that found themselves absolutely in the same situation. So now I'm gonna go over to Carola Mejía from Latindadd. So going to stay within the region. Carola, can you give us from a Latin American perspective what the implications, going back to that conversation about sort of climate, what that is for women, right, and what that could be for the international climate, for the international climate finance conversation. I am keenly aware of the way time is running past. I'm going to ask if you could squeeze that into about 7 minutes so that we've got time to then sort of engage in a Q&A session. So Carola, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chinay. I'm going to switch to Spanish. Muchas gracias a todas las personas que me antecedieron y muchas gracias desde Latindadd por la invitación a este evento. Como ya mencionaban, estamos enfrentando una crisis múltiple con muchos desafíos, principalmente para las mujeres, ¿no? Y como parte de esa crisis múltiple, la crisis climática es algo real, como ya lo mencionaban Alina, Emilia, y tiene sus bases en una responsabilidad histórica y también actual de los países del norte global, ¿no? Que han puesto y ponen en riesgo justamente la seguridad, la salud de las personas, principalmente los países pobres y de ingreso medio, que estamos siendo los más afectados por los efectos del cambio climático y no contamos con recursos suficientes para atender estos problemas y todos los otros problemas sociales y estructurales que tenemos que enfrentar, ¿no? Como altas tasas de pobreza y muchas desigualdades igual que existen en nuestros países. Por ejemplo, América Latina y el Caribe es una región que es responsable de menos de 10% de las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero que causan el cambio climático, sin embargo es altamente vulnerable a los efectos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, estamos siendo afectados por sequías prolongadas, huracanes, retroceso de glaciares andinos, lluvias intensas que generan inundaciones, muchos destrozos, muchos desastres, se están propagando enfermedades como el dengue y todo esto pone en riesgo obviamente a la población. La crisis climática, como ya mencionaba Alina y también Emilia, tiene un impacto mayor en las familias de escasos recursos, en las comunidades indígenas, en los niños, niñas, ancianos y en las mujeres, quienes a su vez, aparte de ser receptoras de todos esos impactos, se han convertido en actores clave también para promover las transformaciones profundas que se requieren para cambiar nuestros actuales modelos de desarrollo, que han sido los que nos han traído a este punto, a este momento en el que estamos enfrentando tantos desafíos, tanto relacionados a la variación del clima, como también las desigualdades inherentes de nuestros sistemas. Nos han dado los científicos menos de 8 años, es una ventana de oportunidad para atender la crisis climática y para esto los gobiernos se han puesto de acuerdo para actuar de manera conjunta, articulada y se han establecido ciertos compromisos, ¿no? Para atender esta crisis y de entre ellos, como ya se mencionaba, hay un compromiso para movilizar 100.000 millones de dólares anuales de países en desarrollo, países menos desarrollados para atender la crisis climática. Lamentablemente este compromiso no se ha cumplido hasta ahora, ya van muchos años en los que todavía no se ha llegado a cumplir esa meta y se ha dicho que se va recién llegar a cumplir esa meta en 2023. Y otra cosa importante es decir que la necesidad de financiamiento para atender toda la crisis climática es más o menos 5 veces mayor a lo que ya actualmente se ha comprometido, ¿no? Ya se mencionaba también las disparidades entre el financiamiento para mitigación, que recibe mucho más dinero que lo que recibe adaptación, que es solo el 25%, y que es una gran necesidad de regiones altamente vulnerables al cambio climático como la nuestra, ¿no? Y en el marco de esta arquitectura de financiamiento climático global, se han establecido fondos como el Fondo Verde del Clima, el Fondo de Adaptación, que pretenden ayudar y canalizar, digamos, recursos, sin embargo, se han vuelto muy burocráticos, muy poco accesibles y en algunos casos tardan hasta 2 años en canalizar financiamiento. Es por eso que se están volviendo, digamos, instrumentos que no están siendo tan utilizados. Por ejemplo, América Latina, el financiamiento climático que viene de fondos climáticos es solamente 10% de ese total, ¿no? El 90%, como ya lo mencionaba Alina, viene principalmente de préstamos públicos, privados, y esto se canaliza principalmente a través de bancos de desarrollo, como el BID en nuestro caso, o la CAF, ¿no? Y estos préstamos lamentablemente incrementan los niveles de deuda en nuestros países, que con la pandemia y con todo lo que estamos enfrentando ya son altos, y obviamente eso es un tema muy, muy complicado que desde Latindadd le estamos haciendo mucho seguimiento, y por otro lado, a mayor vulnerabilidad climática de los países, mayor es la tasa de interés que tienen que pagar, ¿no? Entonces es un círculo de injusticia y al final de cuentas los países del sur, que somos menos responsables de la crisis climática, estamos pagando la deuda climática de los países del norte, ¿no? Y con altos intereses, lo que nos parece sumamente injusto. Y obviamente canalizar este financiamiento a través de préstamos es también una injusticia para las mujeres, porque reduce el espacio fiscal para invertir en temas sociales, reducir la brecha de género, en invertir en temas de cuidado y promover una recuperación verde y feminista, ¿no? Ante esto, y bueno, otro problema que tenemos como regiones también, que somos considerados países de renta media, entonces no podemos beneficiarnos de ciertos tratos especiales para la deuda y también acceso preferencial a algunos fondos, ¿no? Ante esos desafíos, justamente, vemos que a nivel nacional movilizar financiamiento a través de otros mecanismos podría ser una buena solución. Por ejemplo, los gobiernos pueden canalizar financiamiento desde su propio presupuesto, ¿no? Asignando, digamos, dinero específicamente para temas de cambio climático, y el cambio climático tiene que transversalizarse en todos los sectores de la economía, no puede verse solamente desde los ministerios de ambiente, es un tema que debe verse con una mirada muy integral y de largo plazo, ¿no? Otro tema que vemos que es importante son los impuestos verdes, por ejemplo, que en nuestra región están siendo utilizados, pero muy poco, ¿no? Lo que más se genera en realidad son subsidios a los combustibles fósiles que tienen el efecto totalmente contrario, ¿no? Y nosotros vemos que con los impuestos verdes puede haber un gran potencial para recaudar dinero desde sectores altamente responsables de estas emisiones que causan el cambio climático, de estas grandes industrias, de estos grandes sectores, para canalizar esas iniciativas que ayuden a combatir el cambio climático, principalmente con un enfoque en las mujeres, ¿no? Que están siendo altamente golpeadas por este problema. Y cuando estos impuestos verdes son directos, contribuyen a esta progresividad fiscal que tanta falta nos hace en la región y en el mundo, y que nos permitiría justamente gravar a las industrias y a los sectores que son más responsables y que no recaigan justamente en desmedro de los otros grupos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, hay un dato que quiero dar ya para finalizar, Chennai, es que, por ejemplo, Oxfam decía que a nivel global el 1% más rico de la población genera el doble de emisiones que el 50% más pobre, ¿no? Las grandes industrias son las grandes responsables y al final son las que no están respondiendo a esto. Y algo que quería decir también es que en el marco del Acuerdo de París no existe ni un punto, ni una coma, nada que establezca una responsabilidad de estas grandes industrias y las llame a reducir sus emisiones o a pagar impuestos verdes o a hacer algo, ¿no? Para enfrentar este problema. Entonces eso es un problema muy grande, muy grave. Y finalmente, bueno, algunos países también están yendo por la emisión de bonos soberanos, bonos verdes, y esto nos parece desde Latindadd un tema peligroso porque también aumentan la deuda de los países, ¿no? Y ya hemos mencionado justamente cuál es el riesgo de tener, digamos, deudas altas, ¿no? Y que después cuando se tienen que repagar, hay justamente, conllevan a políticas de ajuste estructural, de austeridad, que reducen los recursos para actividades y programas con enfoque de género y que coadyuven a un desarrollo más justo, más inclusivo, sostenible y que esté en línea con el mandato de la Agenda 2030, ¿no? Entonces, quería dejar eso para, digamos, sentar algunos precedentes de lo que está pasando en la región y algunas opciones que se pueden, digamos, visibilizar para enfrentar la crisis múltiple que estamos enfrentando. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Carola. I think thanks so much for walking us through, I think, Latindadd's experience. Like I said before, it's always, you know, really interesting to hear the experiences of different regions, but able to completely understand what you're saying, because the situation you're describing is most completely the situation that we're facing in other regions as well. And I talk for the work that we do on the African continent. So thank you for sharing that and really just kind of reiterating, right, the need for us to be working together as the Global South. So now we have our last panelist, Shyleen Momanyi, who is from the Young Women's Leadership Institute. Shyleen, I think we're really keen to hear your thoughts here, particularly as a young feminist. We know you've been engaging in, the Leadership Academy on Tax and Justice. What's your experience been, and how are you using some of the knowledge that you've gained during that experience? So I'm going to give you about 7 minutes. When you see my screen, that's me tapping you on the shoulder. Thanks, Shyleen.
Thank you so much, Shania, and together with all the panelists who've spoken before me. Those are very informative insights. And as a young feminist working in Kenya, I'd say that this was the Leadership Academy on Tax and Gender Justice was really, really critical in a time whereby Kenya is amid debt. Kenya has imposed very harsh tax rates on Kenyans for young feminists and young women to really understand what is the link between taxes and our economy and the freedom of women and girls in Kenya as well as the continent. So I'll say the capacity building sessions were very critical in helping us understand the role of the government in generating sufficient public revenue and ensuring that it is well redistributed and also rebalanced to ensure that the economy is sustained. However, we are very angry. In the past few months, especially for this year, we've really experienced very harsh like the government really imposing very harsh taxations on basic goods that are really critical for families and especially for the common person who lives basically under $1 a day. So we've really had an outcry of activists of the public really asking to lower maybe food prices, to have conversations with the government as well to ensure that these food prices are reduced. So for a young feminist, for me, the Leadership Academy was very important for me to understand what really is the link between the work that I do on women's rights and tax justice, as well as the economy, and how does that affect how women and girls exercise their rights as a whole. I'll say also currently the Kenyan government also is getting loans from the IMF, and that now we are at 8.02 trillion, and we have our Kenyan lawmakers who are actually pushing for a change in legislation to accommodate a 4 trillion new debt to fundraising budget deficits amid warnings that the country is ahead of a debt distress. So what does this mean to us? And also during the COVID period, our president actually said that we are in debt. However, we are losing 2 billion shillings a day. So you can imagine that we are heading into debt each and every day, but then the government continues to get debts so that all those debts go into corruption. So our government is also not able to hold people accountable, corrupt people accountable, and yet they are able to just see women and girls, citizens of their own country really suffering and not able to access basic needs because of corruption, because they are not able really to sustain the government. Imposing of high rates of VAT then means that we continue to bear the burden we continue to bear the burden, because when you go to purchase something, and for instance, for women who are underpaid, in a research by the International Labour Organization that says that women are paid 76% less than men. Women are paid lesser, but then also incur the same VAT as their counterparts. Women also tend to purchase more public services or more public goods, especially health, than their male counterparts. Women also suffer unpaid care work or unpaid care labor, and yet they still incur taxes. You know, it is so unfair that our governments continue to really frustrate young women and girls, continue to frustrate their citizens. And we need to be really angry enough as younger generations of women and girls and activists all over the world, really, to hold our governments accountable, because we will find ourselves into debt that we need to pay instead of sustaining our lives, sustaining our freedom, sustaining ourselves as humans. You know, so I feel that the conversation is very critical, and also the capacity building sessions should really continue. And as for YWLI, what we're doing is ensuring that the information also is shared to other organizations, other activists, young women and girls, to really understand tax justice and economic justice, and how our human rights and freedoms really interlink. And also really organizing and strengthening the young women's movement in understanding how these issues cut across. So we are really grateful that we are part of the movement as well, to strengthen our capabilities and our knowledge in ensuring that we are the future generations, in ensuring that we hold our governments accountable and ensure that that the taxes or our economy work for us and not for them.
Thanks so much, Shyleen. As you were speaking, there are quite a few people putting comments in the chat. That first of all, thanks for bringing to the fore, I think, the Kenyan case study with regards to debt and how a lot of resources are being spent to repayment, right, rather than key social sectors. And, you know, quite a few people were able to relate to that. So now we're going to head into the Q&A session. I'd like to encourage all of the participants who are with us, please go ahead and put questions within the chat. We have about 20 minutes to really engage on what's been shared or dig deeper into some of the conversations, some of the presentations that were made. There was one question that I actually want to go straight to, and Rosa, I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind breaking this down for us. But within the Q&A, there's somebody asking, you know, the very basic question: what is your definition of progressive taxation? And I think that's so important for all of us to understand, right? For us to continue to want to do this work. And then the next question, because I kind of feel like you spoke to some of these issues already, the question from Francis Gay saying, you know, what are some of the recommendations, specific recommendations on some of the tax reform that we need to see? You mentioned some of these things within your speech, so maybe just to kind of highlight them so that it's at the forefront of everybody's mind. So Rosa, over to you.
Okay. Yeah, what we mean by progressive taxation, progressive taxation means, first of all, that the rate of tax that is imposed on the income of everyone is proportionate to the income itself. So there won't be the possibility for those who have high income to pay relative lower tax rate compared to those who have a low income, which is what happened in the past 20, 30 years. If we look at statistics, and maybe Bhumika is better than me to have a look at that, but since the 70s, the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, there's been a shift on the taxation from the richest towards the lower income and workers particularly. And this has reduced progressivity in the taxation. But this is not the only point. I think that we need to consider that the reduction in progressiveness of the taxation is also due to the fact that many governments have moved, you know, the burden of tax to indirect taxation, to consume taxation. And so we pay more and more on you know, our consumes in tax than what we pay on income. And this is particularly favorable for the wealthier. This is particularly favorable for them because there's not a correspondent or balanced increase of the VAT on luxury goods compared to the taxation that is imposed on normal goods that all people need. And even the exemptions that sometimes governments recognize or allow to some products are not enough to rebalance this situation. So I think these are the two major aspects, including the fact that all the financial transactions that happen virtually, are not taxed. The fact that there's a level of tax evasion and tax avoidance that is unacceptable at a level that has never been before, it's also increasing the burden on workers and ordinary people of the revenue system of a country, and making the possibility for the richest to get more, to have more profit that is not taxed. So these are the key elements that are influencing the situation. And also looking at the gender aspect, there's another issue that I think is very important, the fact that again, since the 70s, the 80s, most part of the care services, thinking elder care services, child care, were included within a social protection system. And in many countries, they were paid through Social Security. But moving those services to the individual demand, individual demand, that they became services that you need to pay, as well as many other private services. And this is putting again more burden on the shoulders of women increasing the injustice that we suffer, women suffer because of this sort of discrimination. I mean, that's the very basic. I'm sure Bhumika can add much more to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, Bhumika, I'm going to.
And there are interesting, honestly, I don't have with me now, but there are very interesting statistics that shows, even OECD statistics, that shows how the tax burden shifted from the high income perceptors to the lowest.
Yeah.
It's publicly admitted, is not hidden even. Yeah,
it's true. Absolutely. We have been seeing, I think, that trend over the past few decades where absolutely the burden is being shifted from high income individuals towards low income individuals. Bhumika, I'm gonna pick you just to kind of pick up on that, but also maybe if you can respond to the second half of that question, which was, we have this issue. What are some of the specific recommendations we could be making to address this, particularly at a systematic level?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Rosa, I am very thankful that you were alluding to the historical shifts, and I just wanted to share very quickly the experience of the United States in particular. So, we've heard of the Occupy Wall Street, after the global financial crisis, the 99%, 1%. So, going back to even the 1950s, 1960s, the top 10% in the United States, and in particular the top 5% in the United States, paid a marginal tax rate of 91%. This fell to 70% under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson in the 1960s. Then 1970s and 1980s, it fell to 50%. Under Ronald Reagan, Thatcher, advent of neoliberalism in the late 70s, it fell to 38%. And after the 1986 tax reform in the United States, to 26%. And as we know, it's at record historical low amounts that the 1%, the 5% are taxed. So you see that in the span of about 40 years, it went from 91% to less than 25%. This is the kind of shift we have been looking at under the last 4 decades of neoliberalism, maybe the last 5 decades of steady, consistent trend toward the way in which the role of the state is being so actively distorted to servicing and facilitating the private sector's needs and demands and its priorities and agenda at the expense of the public sector. For every benefit the private sector gets as a benefit removed from the public sector, that's a clear equation that we know of. So I just wanted to corroborate what Rosa was saying with a clear example. And we know that the shifts in the United States ripple onward to the rest of the world, because part of the economic imperialism in which the United States is at the very center is the kind of impact it has on the World Bank and the IMF and WTO. It imposes its economic agenda onto the rest of the world through loan conditionalities and through the paradigms of private finance and liberalization, deregulation. So in terms of systemic shifts, I want to point out too, the one key systemic shift is really about reformulating fiscal policy design. Fiscal policy today, and that includes tax policy, it includes public expenditure policy, it includes a privatization and labor regulation policy. Fiscal policy and macro policy today is very much centered on repaying debt to international creditors. Repaying debt to international creditors is the quid pro quo, and the kind of threat or the kind of imposition of force upon most of the global South is that without repaying this debt, to international creditors, developing countries get very bad ratings through credit rating agencies. It loses investor and market confidence. And the direct repercussion is that it will not be able to access external finance in the international capital markets and to borrow money, to raise money through debt financing, through bonds, through selling bonds, government securities or bonds. And so there is a direct kind of repercussion, right? There's a direct stick that if the debt is not repaid, then you cannot access money. If you cannot access money, you cannot access the kind of foreign financing needed to pay for imports and needed to run the economy. What are the historical and colonial roots of this is the 5 centuries of colonization that have disarticulated the economies of developing countries, turned them into the suppliers of raw materials and primary commodities, and thus the commodity dependence, unequal terms of trade. I know I'm going many, many steps here, but to understand how fiscal policy is designed, we must understand why developing countries are so dependent on borrowing money from external sources, on raising money from external markets, and from the kind of donor and lender dependency that really puts this inability to do debt default, inability to place the needs of its citizens above the needs of creditors. Yeah. So in order to really reframe this, I think we really need to look at the structures of developing country economies, to look at the dependencies that are woven into the structures, and then a fundamental reorientation of public spending from being categorized as one-off discretionary consumption to that of investment. Public spending is investment, it's not consumption. Our advocacy needs to say that this investment is regenerative. It has a feedback loop. Every dollar that's invested in public services, social protection systems, progressive taxation policies, it comes back multiple fold. In economic terms, it's called the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect is that of rights-based economic and social development, equity, right? The production and investment nexus. Economies are dynamic. They're not just indicators and numbers. So, one, I would say the systemic shift is about recognizing the colonial legacy and really articulating in our advocacy that this is a dependency that was created. It does not just exist as a happenstance. It was deliberately created for a long period of time. And 2, the kind of progressive policies we are calling for is investment, not spending. It's long-term, interactive, regenerative.
Yeah, I think you make such an excellent point, right? I think there is a view, at least by the IFIs, that it's spending rather than investment. But you're right. I think the multiplier effects we see from public sector investment really speak for themselves. So thanks for making that point. So we're going to be wrapping up this Q&A session. So I'm going to now maybe speak to Emilia, Alina, and Carola, give you a couple of minutes just to kind of give some last minute thoughts with regards to what's been said and just to kind of round out this conversation. So Emilia, I'm going to open up to you just to sort of give us a few concluding ideas.
No, really, I don't have anything to say. I think many things have been said. I think we really need to get together to discuss the impacts on this issue on environment. I think this panel has managed to open up. So yeah, thank you for the invitation.
All right, great. Thanks, Emilia. Alina, anything from you?
Yes, thank you, Sanai. I would just like to start by addressing the question on what could be the practical recommendations. So I would like to share this tool developed by CSR and allies for developing progressive taxes and looking at the alternative ways of actually generating resources. So it's called the Principles for Human Rights and Fiscal Policies. So there are ways to mobilizing resources that are progressive. So it helps to kind of give guidelines and frameworks for government, peoples, and institutions to how to generate resources in a progressive way. And to conclude, I would just like to say that we really need a transformative approach and change that we're really working together and need to shift from this unequal economic system towards more progressive and rights-based economy, which works for people and planet. And I would like to say thank you to all the panelists. Yeah.
Anything from your side?
Well, in line of the recommendations, it's very important to implement direct green taxes to levy the companies that are more responsible for the CO2 emissions, the carbon emissions. Also reduce fossil fuel subsidies and also investments and expenditure in these sectors that are contributing to the climate crisis. Reduce the tax evasion to have more money to spend in social care and in other relevant areas, and also reduce the use of debt-creating mechanisms that, as Bhumika was already saying, is part of the heart of the economic system and the financial architecture, and it's what is making our countries very vulnerable to this to all these multiple crises. That needs to be completely changed. And we need to rely on other ways of generating income that are not negative for other sectors, like for example, the women.
Thanks, Carola. And then last but definitely not least, Shyleen, any last few thoughts from your end as we wrap up this session?
Thank you, Chenia. So my last thoughts are for young women and girls to really rise and demand for accountability from their government on tax justice to ensure that our economy works for all of us. Yes.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for that, Shyleen. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this particular session. That was a panel conversation on this topic. And now we're going to pivot into the third and final session of this particular conversation. So we have with us Professor Kathleen Lahey, who is from the Queen's University, Canada. And so Professor Kathleen, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind speaking to us a little bit about the work that you've been doing around the Bogota Declaration. And then I think just sort of share some ideas around how the rest of us could be involved, particularly as it speaks to the conversation we've had. So over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. The work that's going on in relation to the Bogota Declaration is essentially a review of it and an updating of it, because it ran essentially from 2016 through 2021 and grew out of a major conference that was held in Bogota at that time, or a little bit earlier on. And the declaration is important because it needs to be not just a place to look and see what the problems are, but to engage in the opportunity to revision the potential sources of change that can not just plug the holes or restore the degree of equality that may have existed back in the how far do we have to go back? 1940s, 1950s, et cetera. There's never been equality between women and men in any tax system that has ever existed on this planet that I have been able to find. You have to go to almost pre-Roman civil code cultures in order to find anything that even begins to resemble equality. And this is really very pronounced in large numbers of realms in the world. So women have always been under patriarchal structures, unable to really participate in the kinds of activities that add value, that create power, that shape cultures, that set up relationships between women and men, whether they're in a public context, whether they're in their private sphere, et cetera. And this, I think, is something that is coming to a crisis level with all of the negative evolutions that have unplayed a lot of progress that may have been discerned at various key points in the histories of some countries. Yes, some countries have worked on these issues, but invariably they have failed, they have fallen back. And just to give you sort of one overall picture that really, I think, says it all, this pertains to the EU as a whole. But during the period of time when CEDAW was fully in effect, the Beijing Platform for Action was being pursued aggressively with respect to trying to address tax issues specifically. And the CEDAW committee was beginning to say things that should have helped put things onto the correct path. In that period of time, as based on a report that has been issued by the United Nations sort of cross-cultural working group on financing for development, and Leave No One Behind, found that during the period of time leading up to approximately 2 or 3 years ago, the EU had made rapid progress on all of the sustainable development goals except for 2. The first was the failure to succeed more than failing in relation to environmental issues, which were treated as separate from the other not very satisfactory result, which was that the EU as a whole lost 5% of all gender equality that it had existed at the beginning of the 5-year period being studied. And women had actually gone backwards by 5% of total gender equality in the whole of the EU, averaged out, not the same for every country, et cetera. At the other extreme, one of the most successful sustainable development goals was this concept of equality among all and equality between families, where you see the presence of men and their economic status coming into play. And that was a very highly successful sustainable development goal from the point of view of just what the impact was. So this is just by way of stressing that there is literally nothing that happens on this planet and to this planet that does not have tax implications. I have a chart that I'd like to use to try to situate this in a slightly different way, but I think the key thing that I'd like to say right now is that it is truly tragic that the more emphasis is placed on women as to things that they can do to better themselves economically, the worse the care burden specifically is on women. And this is because there isn't a sufficient level of recognition, financing, and so on for the various care activities that are needed to make women's and men's lives equivalent or even moderately equal in any way, shape, or form. And this has to do, yes, with tax provisions, but to elaborate on what we should mean by what we are talking about when we look at tax provisions, progressive taxation as a concept begins to touch what we're after. But what we're really after is not just a high personal income tax rate and a reasonable corporate income tax rate and as low a VAT as possible, if not no VAT completely. We're after changing every single solitary provision that has any tax or fiscal impact with respect to any country and with respect to the countries that link into it or that take advantage of a country for the purposes of their own international transactions objectives. So to just give one example, in the Canadian context, if we just look at provisions in just the federal tax rules, we will find that there are at least 127 provisions that all depend on gender distinctions, and they often relate to tiny, tiny little pieces of tax law. They have maybe nothing to do with the raising of a reasonable rate of tax to be paid on incomes that exist, but instead bring issues that are completely unrelated to what you would think would be a proper subject matter for finding finance for a government and impose taxes on types of transactions that are really just turned into a tax provision because it's easier than using direct taxation or direct legislation to regulate something as apparently irrelevant as the type of car that a person might decide to drive, or how many kilometers they might drive in the course of a year, or something like that. So tax systems have become sort of the place where policy issues that are too hard to solve through responsible governments can often be hidden and packed away, with the result that if you want to see what the true tax impact and spending impact on a country is from a gender equality and green and environmentally protective perspective, it becomes necessary to go right to the core as to exactly how much of the costs to women of what they would otherwise be able to have economically are being taken away by myriad provisions that themselves cut down on the total amount of revenue that is available. And the closer you get to a low-income country scenario, the larger the contribution of these types of really very detailed, usually invisible provisions are used to shift the benefit of the after-tax consumable income to those with the highest incomes. Now, I have had the benefit of learning from quite a few people over time, led by Rosa Pavanelli, her colleague Veronica Montefiore, and many other people, such as Jacques Charmez, who's been working for the ILO on these issues, to try to get a grip on just exactly what it is that does affect total outcomes with respect to tax systems viewed in this larger context. And what is interesting about all of this is that there is literally no way to completely correct every single existing tax provision. And it is leading to an increased demand for social protection payments, which are another form of government subsidy, et cetera, but which are seen as being available to solve all of these problems. What is important that's being brought forward by some of the leading organizations, however, and is increasingly being recognized by feminist perspectives, is that it is absolutely essential to make sure that when looking at all of these issues, they are bringing together every possible change that could be made with respect to the kinds of options that women have available to them. And this is why the Bogota Declaration is in this go-round, once we get sufficient feedback from people who are engaging in this, to the proposition that it is necessary to have care at the center of evaluating all changes, all issues, all policies that affect people and the planet together. And from Indigenous perspectives, which have worked quite hard at dealing with these issues, I think one of the most telling statements that has been made to date by a Indigenous community that has been looking at these issues for some time is women are the first environment. No one had said that in sort of European and non-Indigenous societies for a long, long time. But it is the reality, because what are the lives that the tax system is going to concern itself with? They are the lives of human beings, other beings, the trees, the plants, the rocks, the sun, the water, the earth, the planet. But if there were no human beings, we don't know where the animals and other entities, other forms of life might find themselves, or what would happen to the planet. But we're already getting a very, very good view of just exactly how devastating things can be. And for this reason, I think that it is necessary and urgent to put care at the center of any campaigning that is going forward to as great an extent as possible, because the emphasis really has to be not on what do we do for the environment over here and what do we do for people over there and who do we care about in between other forms of being. It's all an integrated structure that has to work in a constructive way in order to prevent the disasters that people are already living with to just far too great an extent in so many contexts. And so then the question becomes, well, what is a care-based approach to the revisioning of tax transfer, governance, public, private, et cetera, property ownership concepts? We're literally talking about taking all of the components that make up a culture, a society, a thriving unit, a family, an individual, and trying to see exactly what needs to be changed and in what way, and how can this be done. I'll finish off by just asking if it is possible to get displayed the chart that I had sent. And this is a chart that I didn't do, but that the United Nations UN Women did do. I'm just wondering, Caroline, do you have that, or Shania, do you have it?
I don't have it, but Carol or Lays, do either of you have it? Carol, I can see you've unmuted.
Screen share the image?
I think I have it. Hold on just a second.
Yeah.
Let me try to share that screen.
Awesome, thanks, Lays.
Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. This is a chart that some researchers at UN Women put together, I think 2 years ago, and it is an attempt to look at a life course concept of the realities of women's lives and men's lives. And although it doesn't touch everything that would need to be taken into consideration in relation to the move to a care economy and a care-based approach to solutions to gender equality, green, and environmental issues, what it does is it shows that by the very nature of the structures that exist on this planet, and this is an average of all of the data for all of the countries reported on in the United Nations Human Development Report and the UN Gender Equality reports. And what it demonstrates is that despite the impact or the emphasis on education that has been lauded for quite a long time in relation to helping equalize things for women, what you see is very close to almost equal allocation of access to pre-primary education, primary education, and secondary education, but with a 1%, a very durable 1% advantage to males through that period of time. And then what you see is a very interesting shift as the number of boys in secondary education looks like it's practically equal with women. Suddenly you see the result of emphasis on sending girls into tertiary education. And women are 11% higher in their involvement than boys are. When you look, however, at the first red line, you see that the reason that the boys were not in tertiary education to the same extent is that they were going directly into tertiary level STEM programs, science, math, engineering, manufacturing, and construction activities, where they were 97% higher in representation than for girls. This is significant because what it means is that a full extent of education that boys really needed as they became adults was just some secondary education. And if they really wanted to leap ahead of women, they would go into STEM programs, because the next red bit there shows that for the percentage of men aged 25 and older who had some secondary education, for example, 1 year would be enough, is still going to be higher than 15% higher than for women. And they will have larger labor force participation rates because of this educational advantage. Where are women in all of this after they've spent a significant amount of time on their tertiary educations and money and have not managed to get a foothold in the STEM area? They have been waylaid by spending their time, 210% more time, doing unpaid care work than men of their equivalent ages. And at the same time that men are going ahead with higher incomes, they are also holding the senior political and business positions by nearly 200% with respect to women, and 250%, well, 245% more seats in parliaments. And women are expected to live much longer than men.
Kathleen?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me? So sorry. This is really, really fascinating, but we've just been constrained by time now. Is this something that you think you could share with us after the meeting?
Yes, but I'll just make one tiny little final point, which is that what happens is that men also live shorter lives than women, and women's pensions usually disappear to a great extent with the men. So women are left as impoverished at the end of their lives as they are at the beginning. And this is really the sort of structural mechanism that needs to be taken apart in focusing on care issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Really, really fascinating. Carol, I'm going to hand over to you just to say bye to everybody. But just on my part, thank you so much to the panelists for great presentations, and Kathleen, so much for sharing that. Carol.
Thank you, Chennai. I hope my connection is still stable and you can hear me. Thank you all very much. I know we've run out of time. It's 7 p.m. this time of this corner of the world. Quite dark outside. I think you've seen I've already drawn in my curtains. But that notwithstanding, thank you all very much for creating time to joining the conversation. Our campaign is still running till the 25th of March. Till Friday this week. So please join in amplifying our messages on social media. Please feel free to also join in our other global events. The next one will be taking place on Wednesday. It's a tax and education event. So for financing education. And then the next event will be happening on the 24th. We will have a Twitter chat, and we will also have a panel discussion together with our colleagues from PSI and the core group on the Rebuilding Social Organization of Care. So my colleague will be posting information about these events on the chat box. Please take note of them and do join us. We are also having a photo petition for the campaign. Please take a photo of yourself with the campaign message and do share it on social media. And please don't forget to tag the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. As I wrap up, a huge thank you to Rosa Pavanelli for gracing this event as our keynote speaker, as well as the other panelists, Alina, Emilia, Carola, Bhumika, Shyleen. And of course, thank you very much, Kathleen, for talking about the Bogota Declaration, the areas for revisions, and of course, as a way forward, the need to call for sign-ons onto this declaration. And lastly, but not least, Chennai, thank you so much for your excellent moderation of this session. Really, we had a really great time. It was a great time listening to all of you. Thank you very much, and do have a good night and good rest of your day wherever you are calling in from. So thank you all very much.